This is an ABC podcast.
This is the problem. Take a pair of scales of the old-fashioned type into one can of the world.
G'day, Dr. Karl here. Now, I've been lucky enough to work with some really experienced doctors back in my hospital days. Some of them could tell if a patient was seriously ill just by looking at them, even when there was nothing obvious to see. I remember one time when I was a very junior medical doctor. My boss rang me up to come to the emergency department to admit a patient into hospital. My boss was rushing to the operating theatre to carry out an emergency procedure. They'd only laid eyes on the patient and hadn't even spoken to them. And my boss said to me, and I quote, "There's something that worries me about the look of this person. I want you to do an extremely full and thorough admission," unquote. Okay, I followed orders, but I was a little puzzled. The patient looked just fine to me. In fact, they actually looked younger than their age. They were super fit and even trained others in physical fitness and had a truly excellent diet. Honestly, they could have been cast in an ad for glowing good health. Their one complaint was that when eating, they got full too quickly, even before they got halfway through what used to be a regular-sized meal. The medical term for this, by the way, is early satiety. Well, on examination, I found absolutely nothing abnormal. But soon, sure enough, our investigations found a small but very fast-growing and very nasty cancer of the stomach, which unfortunately had already spread too far. Within 8 months, my patient died. Somehow, my boss had sensed that this person was seriously ill. My boss had training, skills and experience way beyond mine. Their clinical wisdom was truly impressive. But surprisingly, it turns out that many of us, even with no medical training, can recognise if another person is sick just by looking at their face. At least in the rather specific and artificial circumstances of a recent medical study. Now, in this study, a group of Swedish people were infected with bacteria. And then separate groups of people from quite different cultures were shown photos of the Swedish people's faces. Okay, now for some specific detail. Some 53 volunteers from Stockholm in Sweden were the test group. Some had been injected with salt water, which did nothing. They were the control group. But the rest had been injected with the bacterium E. coli. All of them were photographed twice, first just before the injection and later at the 2-hour mark. By 2 hours, the people with the E. coli on board had the beginnings of a fever. Their temperature had risen from 37 to 38 degrees C. Their heart rate had increased from 70 to 80 beats a minute. And their immune systems had well and truly kicked into action. A marker chemical called interleukin-6 had increased from its normal levels of about 4 or so to nearly 1,000. And by the way, the full response took another 2 hours to reach its peak and then faded away over the next several hours. All of the Swedish volunteers recovered fully. Now, the people who looked at the photos knew none of this. All they got were photos of faces, and they were asked to identify anyone who looked sick. Now, the photo reviewers came from two cultures, urban and hunter-gatherer. The two urban groups were from Mexico City and the city of Ubon in Thailand. The other three groups were hunter-gatherers from the Sonoran Desert in Mexico and two separate hunter-gatherer groups in the Malay Peninsula, the Manik and the Jahai. And separately in the study, another urban group from Stockholm also looked at the photos to try to pick who was sick. Now you guessed it. Overwhelmingly, people from all the different groups could recognise who the sick people were in that 2-hour photo. Now, there's a huge cultural gap between a city dweller in Stockholm and a forest-based hunter-gatherer in the Malay Peninsula. So the result was a little amazing. We do know that quite a few animals can detect if one of their group is sick. Now, this is more common with species that live together closely in groups. After all, in a group, an infectious disease can spread very quickly. We know that both ants and chimpanzees will separate out infected individuals from their group to protect everybody else. So you might expect that humans, being an ultra-social animal, to also have this ability. And this small study seems to back this up. It seems that subtle cues like a pale face or slightly droopy eyes can be recognised early on as signs of sickness. Maybe our supposed sixth sense could be our sick sense.
You've been listening to an ABC podcast. Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.